Morning. My name is Amy Comstock Rick, and as Mark said, I'm the president and CEO of the Food and Drug Law Institute. I want to start by actually thanking the Every Life Foundation for having me here to speak this morning, and Julia Jenkins, the CEO. But more importantly, I want to start by congratulating all of you. In my career, I have been part of many educational efforts that include a trip to Capitol Hill, and I can tell you it can make a phenomenal difference. I know of many, many situations where one story, one conversation really stuck. I don't know that anyone's ever totally figured out what the magic bullet is for that conversation, but if even just a few of you in the room have that magical conversation on the Hill tomorrow, and I'm sure you will, it can make a vital difference. So congratulations on that. Very quickly, my organization, the Food and Drug Law Institute, is an educational nonprofit. We do educational programs and publications on all issues in the area of food and drug law, any of the subject matters that are regulated by FDA. So in addition to the areas you all care about, we also cover food and tobacco and other related dietary supplements issues. What makes FDLI unique is that we are a membership organization with members from all sectors. So many of your sponsors here today are our members, as well as nonprofits, academics, lawyers and law firms are our members, and we do not take advocacy positions. We educate on important, relevant, timely issues, but we actually do not advocate on the Hill. So with that background, I have been asked to come here today to kind of lay the foundation of the legal issues in food and drug law, and then in terms of drug development. And then I will pass the podium to Paul and Danielle, who will then take a deep dive on some of the issues that are relevant, very relevant to the rare community. But I'll lay the foundation for the general, that they will discuss the exceptions for the rare community. It basically all starts with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, 1938. There were certainly something similar to the FDA before that, but that is the statute that we still talk about on a daily basis. It gives the FDA authority over food, drugs, and cosmetics, and subject matters have been added to that since. But then fast forward to the Drug Efficacy Amendment, which is actually shorthand referred to as the Thalidomide Amendment. Some of you may remember the horrible thalidomide scare prior to that. Thalidomide was actually never approved for use in the United States, but it was approved in Europe, and there were some significant birth defects that resulted after women were taking thalidomide and for early pregnancy symptoms, and it horrified the world what was happening. And it was a result of that incident that the Food and Drug Administration, for the first time, was given the authority to assess the efficacy, the effectiveness of a drug in addition to the safety of the drug. So it was really at that time that the standard that we are living with now was established. Fast forward again to 1976, when the medical device amendments were added to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. For your purposes today, I don't know how many of you are interested in device, but we've been asked only to talk about drugs. But that was a major change in our field when FDA got authority over devices as well, because there are just untold number of devices, medical devices in this country. And they're handled very differently from drugs, actually, so maybe another panel for another day. 1983, the Orphan Drug Act, which Paul and Danielle will talk to you about, so I will not. And then a very significant amendment in 1984 that we are still living with 31 years later. The Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984 specifically was designed to encourage innovation in the pharmaceutical industry and to get generic drugs to market more quickly. It is important to think about that the concept behind orphan drug that Paul and Danielle will talk about, and also Hatch-Waxman, was to change some private industry behavior by using the regulatory authority FDA has. Actually not to change patent life or anything like that, but rather to use FDA's power in approving drugs and in giving exclusivity of how long a drug before it goes to generic, by using that power to then shift what pharma becomes interested in investing money in. Very interesting concept that we are still living with today. Some of you may know this already, but it's very good foundational information. Patents last for 20 years. On average, it takes a drug approximately 14 years from discovery to get to market. You've all heard that before. But that even can vary from disease state to disease state. My background is in a neurological disease, and in fact, neurology clinical trials, for reasons that I'm not going to stand up here and explain, but are very important, take much longer than some other disease state trials. So it's actually longer than 14 years for neurological diseases. But time, for a pharmaceutical company, time is money. It's how they make the money. As long as a drug is on patent, they can sell it exclusively and make profit. This is what we talk about. So the concept of Hatch-Waxman was to extend, using FDA's authority, the time where a drug manufacturer could sell a drug exclusively, basically, and then make money. So it would encourage innovation in areas where otherwise patent time might run out. That's a very superficial explanation, but it shows you how much time matters. It's interesting because obviously in the patient advocacy world, where I spent many, many years, time is everything because time is life. But it's very important to equate that to pharmaceutical companies, time is also, certainly care about life and the value to patients, but time also is a mathematical formula. So very quickly, what Hatch-Waxman did was give 5 years of exclusivity in terms of marketing of a drug for any new chemical entity. So again, it was to encourage innovation to find new drugs. And also has some patent term restoration. Again, it's a very complicated statute. I won't go into it all, but the important thing is that it guaranteed time. And the last amendment that, there's many amendments, but of significance that I just want to make sure we cover is what we call the PDUFA, and I'm sure you've all heard about that. That's every 5 years a statute that is heavily negotiated with the industry and then ultimately passed by the Hill. Fundamentally, what it did was create for the first time a filing fee, basically, that industry, when it wanted to get a new drug approved, needs to pay the FDA, literally as a filing fee. They can be pretty significant, though. And it brought more money to the FDA to allow them to staff up, because what was happening is drug approvals were also getting behind because FDA didn't have enough resources. And it was a way to shift that the heavy users in terms of manufacturers would provide more of the funding to FDA to get drugs through the FDA process faster. Very important. PDUFA gets renegotiated every 5 years and is extremely important, as I think many of you know, to the advocacy community, because it is where many other FDA-related issues, including patient engagement and patient-focused drug development, can come up. Luckily, there's no quiz at the end of this. All right, this is a very detailed slide. It can be found, I think all of you may know this, but just in case, it's a great advocacy tip. Anything that is on a government website, FDA or otherwise, is in the public domain. So you may use it. You shouldn't alter it, but you may use it as appropriate for your purposes if it's helpful. Thus, I took FDA's slide. What this slide does is go through in very good detail, this is actually an excellent slide, the various steps of therapy development, and I thought it'd be very useful for my purposes here today. The first phase of drug development, you'll see this goes through steps 1 through 12. The first preclinical phase, it generally takes between 5 to 6 years, and involves animal testing and lab and toxicity testing. Often FDA will require that in the preclinical phase, a drug be tested on at least 2 species. Obviously, for rare diseases, there may be differences, and for many diseases, there's differences. But this is actually in such an early stage where drug development can be very controversial. Again, in my background, in a neurological disease, there was a general belief that we had cured that disease in mice many, many times, but had not yet made progress in humans. So this already, just at steps 1 and 2, can be a little bit controversial. Step 3 is phase 1 clinical trial, which, as I think all of you know, is a safety test. In larger diseases, it will often be conducted with healthy participants, but not always. And that phase generally will take about 1 to 2 years. Phase 2 trials generally takes 2 to 3 years. And that is with the affected population generally, generally with a control group, and that is for the first time where testing efficacy. You could certainly collect effectiveness data in phase 1, but that is where it has to be collected, and where endpoints for future clinical trials begin to be established in terms of how you will assess whether this drug is actually working. Again, that can be a little bit of an advocacy point and a controversial point because FDA tends to be, historically, there can be issues on FDA's level of acceptance of surrogate endpoints, meaning measures that are not a direct measure of the disease, but another effect in your body that you can measure. And then phase 3, of course, takes at least 2 to 3 years. My experience is usually longer. And in traditional trials with large non-rare diseases, the gold standards, it is considered double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, and FDA would like to see 2 of them, 2 clinical trials that can be designed differently. Interestingly, the law does not require 2 clinical trials, regardless of how large the disease is. The law says adequate and well-controlled studies. And so that is an important difference between what has to happen and what actually the law does in fact require. And as I said when I started, Paul and Danielle will, after I speak, then go into and say, that's why you don't have to listen to anything she said, because for rare diseases, but it is important for you to know what the exceptions are for. Then, we won't talk about this a lot, but it's for the manufacturer perspective, the next step is a review meeting with FDA where they discuss at the end of the phase 3 clinical trials, and when they're ready to apply to get the drug approved, they have a very important meeting with FDA where they talk about the NDA and what any weaknesses, where there might be needs for additional studies, that kind of thing. To the industry, that's a very important step. And then the next step generally doesn't get talked about as much in the patient advocacy community, in my experience, but it's a really important step, and that's labeling. In fact, a drug can only be labeled and therefore communicated, meaning promoted or marketed, for use in the population and the condition for which it was approved. Very basic concept. You're looking at me thinking, why is she saying this? That's so obvious. But the fact is, often a company knows way more about a drug than than the population for whom it was approved and for the condition it was approved. And labeling is where the words get negotiated with FDA in terms of what can be said about this drug and for whom. The reason that is very, very important is, as many of you know, between 20 and 40% of drug use is actually off-label. Meaning that it is an approved drug, but it's being prescribed for a condition or for a population other than for which it was approved. This explanation is a grammar test to make sure I'm proper. And FDA has historically been very strict in terms of enforcement for any promotion of off-label use of a drug, but it's perfectly legal because in the law, FDA is prohibited from regulating the practice of medicine. So a doctor can prescribe however they want, but then we worry, well, how does the doctor know everything the manufacturer knows if pharma can't communicate that? I'm almost out of time, so I'll hurry up. There are some exceptions. for scientific exchange, as well as some recent exceptions about what the manufacturer can say to insurers, payors, as well as for unsolicited requests for information. But this is a really important area where we're still seeing a lot of change because patient advocacy organizations are seeking more information, as well as the courts are being a little bit more supportive of the First Amendment rights of manufacturers to say accurate information about what they know about a drug, even if it's not on the label. So that is the fastest explanation of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act I think I've ever given. I hope you will find it helpful. The last stage, phase 4, I think many of you know, is often also conditioned, the approval of a drug may require gathering of additional data by the manufacturer. I just want to close with my advice for tomorrow is to tell your stories and to be as powerful as you can, but in your future advocacy, it's very important to arm yourself with as much information about the rights and authorities of FDA, as well as patients, as well as sponsors. It's an evolving field always, and the more information that you have, the less likely it will be that someone can kind of push you away just by saying, well, we don't do it that way. And the more you know, the easier it is to say, well, why not? My organization, the Food and Drug Law Institute, actually is well known for introduction to drug law courses, generally designed for attorneys and regulatory affairs professionals, but we offered one last November, and I believe someone from the Every Life Foundation participated, and Bio was one of the sponsors. Introduction to Drug Law for Patient Organizations. And it was a intense 2-day course, much more detailed on the entire drug approval process. And we will be offering it again, I believe, this November. And so I have the website there for Megan Crowley in my office, the email, who is responsible for organizing it. So if you want to be contacted when the date and all the information for that comes out, I'd encourage you to consider it. It's extremely low cost. It's a minor registration fee just to make sure, just to control no-shows. And I would encourage you to think about that. So thank you for your time.